I never remember like which computer or like device I log in on for which Zoom meetings, and it'll be like, Allison, ritual advisor, Allison, student government president, Allison, Indianapolis, IUPUI. And I'm like, I need to stop doing this because it is not helping me. crazy to think we've come this far, and we've done, you know, so many books and over the years, and, you know, some of you have stuck up with us for the last couple of years and maybe the last couple books. And trust me, there will be a lot more. So if this is your first time, welcome. We have a lot of great reads set up for the rest of this semester. For the rest of the season, and or semester, we can call it a semester. If you are not familiar, you can go to Indiana Humanities and you can see the list of books we have lined up for this season. One of our wonderful partners, thank you, Megan, Indiana Sciences, Indiana Humanities, CINSO, Central Indiana Science Outreach, and then of course our wonderful Indiana Public Libraries. We love our public libraries. And they're wonderful partners, and they help us continue to put on this wonderful book club so we can talk about fun animal stories with you all. Yeah, thank you, Megan, for putting in the chat. If you want to go ahead and get the next couple books. Now, I don't want to brag, but next month's book, not even just next month, the rest of I've already bought them all. I'm just telling you, I've already started reading some of them. I'm so excited. So I mean, I know we're starting off with a banger with Fuzz, and it's going to be a lot of fun to talk about, but the rest of the season is going to be a lot of fun. So I hope you'll stick with us for the rest of the season and hopefully come see us in person as we hope to return to in person. But we thank you for being flexible with us as we endure through all of this that is happening. We thank you for joining us. And so enough babbling. We're going to get started. I'm so excited to get to meet our guest with you all, Angela Yang. And so you know you better than anyone else. So go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do.
Hi, I just wanted to thank everyone for for the invitation. And I was just telling Allison earlier, just for forcing me to read a book. It was on my resolution list to read more books. So this is a good one to start with. My name is Angela Yang. I work with the Global Center for Species Survival. It's a new initiative. It is based at the Indianapolis Zoo and works kind of globally with, I should go into the IUCN. So this center is a partnership between the IUCN, which is the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and it's this global authority, and the Indianapolis Zoo. So the IUCN is this huge body based out of Switzerland, and there's about 18,000 experts that mostly volunteers, but people who have expertise in essentially 6 areas. So where we fall in is with the Species Survival Plan Commission. And so there's, I'm trying to think how many of us are in Indiana right now. There's 3 of us in Indiana, 2 coming. And we just recruited a bird coordinator who's Nigerian, will be coming here in hopefully sometime this year. So I happen to be the mammal coordinator and the mammal lead for the center. And I guess this is kind of, it fits in well because I started off in zoos many, many years ago. So there is kind of a zoo link, but I also ended up working for a lot of international NGOs. So I've lived around the world. I spent 4 years in Cambodia, 3 years in Kenya, another 3 years in London. And so this book was actually really interesting to me because it actually talks about human-elephant conflict and some of the other conflicts I've actually had to deal with. So it's kind of relevant, and yeah, that's a little bit about me. So.
Yeah, wow. So it sounds like you have a lot of experience in some of these topics. And I initially was only going to talk about the bear specialist group because I have to know what a bear specialist group does.
So the bear specialist group, technically there's 36 mammal specialist groups, and they range from bears to elephants, both the Asian and the African species. So there's 2 groups, and the primates and everything else. So to make my workload a little bit lighter, we kind of partitioned off the marine mammals. So those go off to our marine coordinator. So each of these specialist groups are comprised of anywhere between, I'd say about 100 is the smallest. Well, there are very specialized groups. So the groups range from about 100 to the primate specialist group has about 800 members. So there's these chairs, and they have they all have their governance structure. And so our role in doing this is, so these folks are like the experts in their field. They're like the top bear specialists in the world. And they say basically that a big chunk of what the IUCN does is assessments. So you'll hear words like critically endangered, vulnerable, threatened. So what the bear experts do, and the same in all the other areas, is they do the assessments and figure out where, say, the bears sit. I'm going to use the panda as an example. So they've gone from, I think, endangered to vulnerable since the last assessment. So they just figure out kind of where they sit in kind of the conservation world and how urgent actions need to be to conserve these animals. So with the bear specialist group, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's what I was going to ask. I want to know more about this bear.
So the bear specialist group, you'll read in chapter 2, you've read in chapter 2, Dave, he's actually one of the co-chairs of the bear specialist group. So basically there's actually 7 species, 7 out of the 8 species in the remake, because polar bears are technically marine and they have their own group. So they do a lot of research. It's interesting because I sat in on one of their meetings last month, and you'd be surprised that there isn't North America a lot more research in the brown bears and the grizzlies, which are a subspecies of the brown and the American black bear. But some of the other bears, like in South America, the spectacle bear, sun bear, and sloth bear in Southeast Asia, not a lot of research, not a lot of kind of continued and focused research on bears. So there isn't a lot known about them, and ranges are not clear. So that's kind of their remit to help the world understand better about, where they sit in this kind of conservation, in this category structure. I think most bears are in the endangered category, except for the American species. And what conservation actions are needed. So, and also along with that, and they've identified there is a research gap here. So in my last conversations with them, because bear research is tough, you read a little bit about that, that also just people don't, and there's a question about kind of the cute animals, and surprisingly, because bears to me are charismatic and they're cute, that not more attention are given to them. So the bear specialist group is kind of working on a number of things, is better research for bears, especially those ones that need more research and need to be studied more. But also simultaneously, I guess, making people aware of the conservation needs. It's interesting with the North American bears, because there's a lot about bear conflict, and we actually met up with another bear specialist, and it's amazing that kind of the scale, and there's been so much done with bear conflict here in North America. And my comment was, you need to be getting this information out to people. So, I think that's kind of where we sit, is trying to get, there's some great scientists out there, and sometimes a communication process, getting this information out, and also awareness, fundraising, and ultimately leading to conservation action. I think that's kind of where we sit.
So how do these bear specialist groups then, or even these mammal specialist groups, it seems like there's a heavy conservation angle, but in the book, they're really focusing in on like human animal interactions, and that seems to be through like local wildlife offices. So what does that interaction look like?
It ranges a lot. It depends on a lot on capacity, right? So in North America, with the U.S. government, Fish and Wildlife Service, USGS, there's a lot of capacity to kind of take closer look. Looking at garbage bears and all of that, and testing out, piloting different ways to manage that conflict. So I think it's much simpler in a country like this, when we're looking at South America or India or any of these other countries where resources are more limited, and there's also some cultural aspects. So interestingly enough, one of my housemates when I was living in Cambodia is the CEO of Free the Bears. So he deals with a lot of these animals that have been traded in the pet trade mostly, or confiscated for one reason or another. It's generally people want them as pets. And so I don't know if there's a lot of conflict going on with the sun bears. Are smaller and less intimidating. But I think it just varies a lot depending on where the bears are, the regions, and the capacity that is out there.
Now, you said you've worked with multiple specialist groups, and it seems like you have some knowledge on the elephant group. I'm kind of interested, how are these different, like working with, bear specialist groups and elephant specialist groups? And I'm kind of curious how much you think culture maybe plays a role in that.
Quite a bit. So there's a big difference between the Asian elephant specialist group and the Africans as well, because there is a very much a cultural influence in Asian elephants and the captive elephants in particular. So there's a long history of keeping elephants and kind of using elephants. So that is quite different from the African elephant specialist group, which is very focused on the conservation part and preventing poaching. So yeah, it's all kind of there is the human component, all of this, and as you've read through this book, is very strong, and that kind of influences how resolutions and how the conflicts are addressed. So yeah, with bears, I think the Asian bears are much smaller, so they're not quite as intimidating as the grizzly bears, and but human elephant conflict is a huge issue in Asia and Southeast Asia. I worked on a project in Thailand with the Zoological Society of London, and talking to some of the villages out there, it's kind of that lack of comprehension of the animal and the ecology of the animal. And the big thing they wanted us to do is get rid of the elephants. And it's like, well, that's not going to work, because another elephant is just going to come back and take its place. So what I was trying to do was trying to talk to the villages out there in a way that kind of helps explain what the issue is. So basically, it's like a free buffet. So why wouldn't you go to a free food? So that's a kind of the way you have to think of it. So if it's us and there's a free buffet of my favorite food out there, I'm going to be there every day.
Yeah.
And I think, and that's just kind of explaining to people how this works. And this is exactly, and putting it in a context that people understand.
Right. Thanks for letting me know.
Yeah, so that's kind of that kind of socio-cultural, a lot of politics as well, as you see in the book.
Oh yeah, you definitely see that. Multiple examples too. It's not even, only in this country or that, it's something that everyone's dealing with.
Yeah, definitely. And you'll find that political will to kind of address things is important as well. Nepal, I was just talking to a colleague about Nepal today. No, it's not in the book, that they've had some great successes with kind of their protected areas and getting their tiger numbers increased and preventing poaching. It's because there's a lot of political will behind it.
Interesting. And you even talk about communication on these topics, which it's been a running theme, in this book club, is communicating science. The way we do science is not really inherently makes it easy for us to translate that to something that's like usable by really anyone else outside the academic sphere. And it's so tough.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that storytelling part, and Nat Geo actually has a big focus on this, is there's a lot of great research being out there. It's just not being communicated well. And we continue to, and I get it. I have these discussions with the people at the zoo as well. We name animals and we try to build these relationships with individuals, but we also need to talk about the bigger story.
Oh yeah. And that can be, that's tough. So thank you. We usually talk about this from especially medical science in the way, with just everything going on, talk about it a lot in the sense of medical and clinical science, but even in conservation and ecological science, it's so important. It's just it's very pervasive throughout the sciences. And so, I love the approach that, conservation and animal science and even plant science has really been able to take off And I feel like the rest of us could really learn something from y'all because I feel like you do it so well.
Well, I think it's fairly new to the conservation world as well. So I think it's still a learning process.
Yeah, well, isn't everything, right?
Yeah.
So I'll bring us to our first turn and talk because you talk about the cuteness of the animal kind of playing into, we'll say public perception, but the book also talks about like media response, and they mention this particularly in India. They felt like the media response to monkey attacks was really just blowing it out of proportion, and that's why people wanted something done, not because on paper it's really that big of an issue. And so it both, I think the cuteness of the animal kind of plays into whether or not, media might report this. And again, this is happening, I think, everywhere. I don't think it's specific to the India example. We see it with bears too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cute teddy bear, they're furry, that we like anthropomorphize them and make them cute and approachable, but like they really are not cute. I mean, they're cute, but they're not approachable. And so the first turn and talk, which if you are new here, our turn and talks will, in the Zoom world, will bring you out we'll break you out into little Zoom breakout rooms with usually like 4 people. And you guys can talk about this question amongst yourselves. Me and our guests will talk about this question on the live stream, and then we'll all come back in like 10-ish minutes. And we can all talk about what you talked about in your individual groups. You'd be surprised how many directions 4 groups even can take a single question. We always get good discussions out of this. So my first turn and talk is about this media element and this like cuteness element. And they even talk about this with, like, for example, the possums in New Zealand. They're so fluffy and cute, and so it makes it hard for maybe the correct action to be taken, or it actually changes the direction the government or whatever regulating entity will take on an animal. So my question to you is, how much do you think media reporting is driving public response to these pest animals or these criminals, if we want to stick with the law and order theme? And do you think that the cuteness of the animal affects how the public maybe will go to the media, or how the public reacts to these animals? And do you think, or do you have any examples where maybe government response or regulating agency has changed their action because an animal was super cute and the public didn't want anything to happen, or even though it's going through the trash and it's making a ruckus, but ooh, they're so cute, we don't want to do anything. Or maybe you can think of another better example. I just keep thinking of cute possums, which maybe is my own bias. So in our turn and talks, I hope you'll maybe address, I know that's like a lot, it's a loaded turn and talk, but I think they all kind of play into each other. The media portrayal of animal interactions, the cuteness of the animal, how that affects public response to the animal, how the media amplifies public response, and then it all kind of gets put on a single conservation officer. So I'm curious to see what your thoughts are and how maybe you think about this question. So I'll give you like 10 minutes. We'll come back right at 7 o'clock. If you feel like that's not enough time, we can maybe extend it 7:02, 7:03. And then we can come back and talk about maybe we can talk about cute animals. Maybe we talk about media. I don't know. I will copy and paste the question in the chat because it was very long and I apologize. I'll do here. Let me do it before we do breakouts. Okay. Now this way, everyone got it. You are welcome, Hannah. No, that was a good point. Okay. So I will see you all soon. You are being invited to a room. You can go ahead and click join, and you'll go meet your compatriots who you will talk about animals. Hopefully they're cute. I'm muted. Okay, sorry. I went out to the breakout room and I was like, where am I? Okay, we will stay here in the main room. So I'm curious. I mean, most of your, it seems like you have a lot of experience with bears, and I mean, the teddy bear thing just cannot be helpful. I mean, it's gotta just make it hard. Oh, you're muted.
And
Oh, there you go.
yeah, yeah, no, I think you're right about the possums, and they are incredibly cute. It's really tempting, and they're docile. It's funny because we talk a lot about this because it kind of links to the illegal wildlife trade as well, right? Because people want these things as pets. And, that's another driver. This is what happens with the sun bears. People think they're cute little bears, they're going to be great pets. And then, they grow up, they've got these giant claws. and, it becomes a conflict issue, right?
Yeah. But so
Yeah.
how does, as a conservation officer, a conservation, expert professional, how does that affect your job?
I think it's trying to turn people around and getting people to think a little bit broader. I mean, there's been a lot, people don't focus on the species that we don't talk about in the media, right? They're not attractive, they're not furry, they're not cute. We have a plant and fungi expert on our team, and she's always quite kind of jaded because no one pays attention to the fungi, which are amazing, right? Because all of us, our entire lives revolve around fungi, with bread and beer and everything else that relies
Yeah.
on these organisms. But people don't understand that, and I think we're doing a far better job these days about telling those stories as well as the teddy bears.
I gotta say, we read Entangled Life back in, I think, August of last year. I cannot recommend it more. Completely open. Now I'm going out into our local parks and I'm like, oh, look, I read about this oyster mushroom. And I am so excited about molds now that I get. Maybe I shouldn't be so excited about mold, but yeah, absolutely. We have to talk about it and, get past the fact that we can even get past the cute fuzzy and we can make it interesting and make it engaging with something like a fungus that I think most people would think of and go, oh, what? you want like mold? Like
it's great. It's interesting because I actually hadn't paid a lot of attention until the pandemic came, and then you run out of things to do, and it has to be outdoors, and so you can't go very far. So I went to the local nature preserve. I was living in Virginia at the time, and you start seeing these things you've never seen before, and it's fantastic. It's like going on a friend and I were doing this all the time, and it was like going on a mushroom safari almost, because they're incredible shapes and colors, and yeah,
oh yeah,
things you do
I
to
was
keep
doing the same
entertained.
thing. Yeah. Oh yeah, I've kept me entertained, my partner, my in-law, everybody, and they're like, "What are you doing?" We call it a pandemic hobby. I'm kind of curious. I hadn't even thought. I mean, the book doesn't really talk about this. I hadn't even thought about illegal wildlife trade. Both live animals, and I'm assuming even like animal parts and furs have to play into that. I hadn't even considered that as like even a motivator to keep pest species if there's profit to. I hadn't even thought of that.
Yeah, I mean, they're quite linked, right? Because you get the conflict issues that arise from people kind of bringing animals into places where they're not introduced species, invasive species. How there was the story about New Zealand and how people wanted to bring the animals they're familiar with, happened in Australia as well, and to bring them into this foreign place because that's what people kind of wanted, and people's cats, obviously.
Oh yeah.
So I think the invasive species quite often is driven by illegal trade, or it could be accidental. I don't know if they're here or not, the monk parrots that now live and are pests in New York, London, many countries, all came from the pet trade. And they're an invasive species. They're out competing other animals, and they're creating a ruckus out there. They're noisy.
Also, not a human animal interaction we would rather not have.
Yeah, I mean, you don't think of them when they're individuals. They don't seem like they're that troublesome, and then you see colonies of them, and then you think they're displacing native animals as well. So Yeah, they're not going to hurt people, I don't think, but they are hurting the local wildlife.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. So how much of, I guess, how much of your work is, or even maybe all animal work, it seems like there's the invasive species problem is just huge and maybe insurmountable. I don't know. But I mean, how much does that play into trying to convince, I guess, people, yes, it's an animal that is cute and in itself harmless. It's a harmless bird, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't seem like much trouble, but it is an invasive species. That makes it a problem, and that makes these interventions necessary. That seems like a hard hurdle to kind of get over.
It is, and again, it goes back to culture, right? Because people want to keep things and collect things. That's just in our nature, and I think that kind of drives. I sometimes, because I've lived abroad for a while and coming back to this country, we sometimes have that conversation that it's like it's happening over there, and we need to fix the traditional Chinese medicine trade. And it's like, well, it's also happening right here with there was just a reptile and amphibian, some kind of pet expo here in Indianapolis a few weeks ago. And it's like, I can probably guarantee you that some of that is not legal. Um,
Yeah.
so it's kind of having that conversation and making people, I find it, especially in North America, that people think it's not us, and it is us.
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
talk all the time. I lived in Florida for 20 years. You want to talk about illegal animal trade? You want to talk about invasive species? I
Yes.
am with you.
Yeah, and you talk about conflict in Florida with the pythons and everything else. It's like, wow. Iguanas.
We were just talking about the iguana falling out of the tree because it's getting below freezing in Florida. I think this
Mhm.
weekend, and we were
Yeah.
talking about how they every year they fall out of the trees. Every year they tell us they're like, do not touch the cold iguanas. They will wake up. And every year people put them in their backyards thinking it's dead, and it's not. Probably good for the
Yeah.
iguana though. He's probably eating a lot of mangoes.
Well, Florida's the place to be. I mean, they're taking over with the pythons pretty much eating everything out there.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. So I'm with you on but maybe
Yeah.
the Midwest is a little harder to see because every one, if you're not trained in that, you don't know about it. Especially plants. I think that is
Mhm.
so underrepresented in
Yeah.
the invasive species because it's harder to see.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm trained as a cell biologist. I know very little about plants, and if I just looked at a plant, I wouldn't know if it was invasive or not. And so it's,
Yeah.
oh, conservation is about the green movement. We want to keep all plants. And it's like, no, there's a difference.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And because I'm not from this area, that I actually try to go out with people who know plants and birds and everything else better because I can't identify them. But in going out I noticed, or I've been told that there are a lot of invasive species out here.
Okay, well, I mean, everything
Yeah.
as well in the Midwest, right? I mean, we grow
Yeah.
so many vegetables and grow so much for the country,
Yeah.
it grows, they'll put it down. I mean, but so
It's,
I guess, how do you approach, I guess, education around, yes, green movement, eco-friendly, all about saving plants and trees, but there's the distinction. How do you add that nuance?
it's hard because I think, and another pandemic hobby that came up while I was stuck at home was houseplants. And so I
Yes.
was I was introduced to the world of these collectors and these exotic houseplants. And then it's the same with pets and reptiles and everything else. People collect really rare plants and they sell for tens of thousands of dollars. And a lot of this is also being done illegally because people don't care about plants. So
What?
people put them in a little poster tube and they send them by mail through USPS as long as there's this phytosanitary certificate. I don't think the customs people know what they're looking at. So there is one plant that is the Philodendron Spiritus Sancti. There's like maybe 6 plants left in the wild, and it's huge in the plant trade here. I don't know where they're getting them, they're cloning them, but those sell for probably I've seen them go for over $20,000. So
What?
I know it was all new to me as well. Another pandemic thing that I learned last year.
That is so, well, I mean, the indoor plant thing, I mean, we went sourdough bread, indoor plants.
I know people ran out of things to do.
Yeah, you're opening my mind to whole new worlds. I had never thought about an illegal indoor plant trade. This is a new era of the pandemic.
Yeah, well, I mean, most of the time I think it's legal, but I think there are people in these very rare groups that do question, and rightfully so. It's like, I want to know where these plants came from. And they should,
Yeah.
because people are sending them from Ecuador or from Indonesia just in a FedEx box.
Yeah, and I mean, that really, which the marvels of the 21st century, let's start there. But I mean,
Yes.
not even regarding, there's a reason we have customs officers, right? We have this process because those are important.
Yeah, but see, again, I don't think people really care, or they're not paying attention because it's a plant. I think if it was a koala, it might be different.
Yeah, I think if I had a plant in my house versus a koala in my house, I'd probably be thinking a little bit more about putting the koala in my house. But maybe,
Yeah.
Get a playroom. I don't know. Welcome back. I think all the breakout rooms have, I don't know how to. Okay, I think all the breakout rooms have come back. Hello, we are talking about putting animals and plants in our house. We covered everything, y'all. I mean, the live stream has got to be such a different experience than coming here in person because I always go off the rails. So I'm curious, what did you all talk about, and what were some of the things maybe you considered, or some of the examples you came up with? I love hearing from the breakout rooms.
Well, we actually talked about how sharks really, statistically speaking, sharks aren't really that big of a deal. And say deer are cute, but they actually kill a lot more people than sharks. But sharks are ugly. That was one of the things. We had other things to say too. Does anybody else in my group like to say anything? But
pretty much predators always get a bad rap because they're predators. So, the amount of people who are killed by the cute and fuzzies, but it's not as sexy to say, so-and-so hit a deer and died. So-and-so got stampled by a cow and died. They don't even like talking about how many people get trampled by bison at Yellowstone. It's always the bears. And, I was surprised in the book that there's never been a single documented wolf killing, right? And the amount, like, all these animals, it's very rare just because there are few of them and they're not really out there to get people. But that's what the media likes. They like teeth and claws and these big scary predators. They don't want to announce. It's the equivalent of, you'll hear every time a plane crashes, but so many more people die in car crashes, and it's just not sexy. It's not big. It's not a wow.
Yep. I was also going to say, we also brought up the idea of like the fact that cuteness gets a lot more of the prestige is kind of from the idea of people just thinking short-sightedly and not thinking of the interconnectedness, how the animals are interconnected with the natural world and with us. And even if someone looks past the cuteness, they might not see it. Like, we give the example of like people saying, oh, we should save the elephants, we should save the tigers. But if there's still deforestation going on, that's still a problem for those animals, because then they run out of land. And that could lead to things like tigers encroaching on, tigers and leopards encroaching on people's property and things like that. So, yeah.
I mean, they talked about that in the book too, right? That we're sitting here, we created this problem for ourselves, and then we turned around and, oh, it's a problem. Oh God, why is this happening? It's our, we're in their backyard. They're not in ours, and yet we're calling pest control on them. And it doesn't. We have to like keep that in mind sometimes when we're complaining about elephants trampling farmland, or bears coming and rummaging through our trash. We kind of took up roost in their house, and now we're the ones complaining about it. I mean, beggars can't be choosers, and apparently we're pretty choosy beggars. Did anyone else come up with any other examples? And we're not even going to bring up Bambi about the deer. We're not even going to go there because we all know Bambi's super cute and is probably 99% responsible for us not seeing deer as deadly as sharks. But maybe there's another Disney movie I'm not thinking of. Oh, Rita, if you're trying to contribute, you're muted.
Okay. The only thing is if we're trying to protect deer, we're not doing them any favors because they overpopulate, they get sick and very, very skinny. And so by protecting them, we're not helping them. Yeah.
Oh yeah, we even talked about that. You know, me and Angela, we were talking about, you know, we think this to be environmentally friendly, to be pro-conservation equals no plants or animals can die. We have to save and protect everything because it's all plants and we're not considering invasive species, and we're not considering population control being really beneficial. And we don't talk about that. It's save everything or everything's on fire. And there is nuance to, you know, in the environmental ecological system that we need to think about.
We could only get the deer to eat the bush honeysuckle, then
Right.
feeding the deer and keeping them healthy and also getting rid of a really nasty invasive species.
Yeah, if we could come up with like the perfect mechanism to make that work, that'd be like our golden ticket, right? Although all this talk about deer, I hope you all appreciated the backlit grill light that they were talking about in Ohio to help alert the deer so that they were less likely to get hit by fast oncoming vehicles. I thought that was really interesting. Although living here in Indiana, this is my first experience with deer. I feel like those of you who are from the Midwest probably appreciated that. And that seems like something that you could, you know, kind of make on your own pretty easily. So maybe something to keep in mind in the future. And I'll bring this up because this is something that me and Angela talked about. We even talked about the illegal wildlife trade and how that cuteness factor influences illegal trade of animals and how that contributes to animal pest problems and maybe hesitancy to get rid of them because they're a moneymaker. It's profitable to keep these possums in New Zealand because their fur is really valuable. So why would you get rid of them if it's ecologically valuable when somebody can make a ton of money? I mean, I hadn't even really thought of that. But I mean, seems like a strong motivating factor for multiple animal species and probably, I mean, definitely plants too. But that's really interesting. So thank you all for contributing. I always appreciate hearing what you guys have to talk about. I hadn't even mentioned deer once, and I'm glad that y'all had a whole discussion about deer. Because I mean, obviously here we hear about them and sometimes see them a lot. And so, you know, all of these, I'm calling them, you know, invasive or pest animals. I don't know if I want to call them pest animals, but we'll call them animal intruders or human animal interactors, these animals that are talked about in the book, let's say. I thought, you know, a lot of it obviously comes down to usually some sort of government agency, whether it's like Fish and Wildlife or a conservation officer, is usually the intervening party if somebody doesn't take matters into their own hands to deal with this animal, you know, interaction, right? I thought it was interesting that throughout the book, both the author and the wildlife officers kind of refer to themselves, and the author refers to them as naturalists. They enjoy nature. They enjoy being in nature. They enjoy protecting nature. But towards the end, it seems, the author even notes, this seems like kind of a conflicting moniker, just because so much of the job does involve killing animals. And it seems counterintuitive, but ultimately, especially when we're talking about invasive species and overpopulated species that are harming themselves and others, it's kind of part of the job. So are those, I'm kind of interested, Angela, to hear from you and maybe your experience. How does that work, I guess, in this line of work?
I think it's a part of kind of when you're a conservationist, it's kind of what you do. So it's not completely, most people are really pragmatic about things. And I have to say that culling is not, in most cases, culling just doesn't work. I think it's also mentioned in the book. There's been mass efforts at culling. Culling is just basically another term for killing animals, and keeping populations under control. In most cases, it doesn't work. There are some extremes where it does. And island nations, there's Floriana Island in the Galapagos is an example where it's a massive cleanup program for invasives. They've actually, I think they've moved people off, and they're going in there. Island conservation, also mentioned the book, is going in there to go basically kill all the invasives and then move people back. So that's an extreme measure, but you're looking at island nations, and I think that's, there's so many island endemics, especially in the Galapagos, that are at risk here, and you're trying to restore an ecology back to an island. So that's kind of, people can be naturalists, conservationists, but still kind of understand the need to be able to manage populations, especially since we've also managed to screw them up. So we have to go in and fix it. So it's not usually the core of what you do. You want to prevent things from getting to that situation. That I think there are, I do have conservationist friends who are hunters, and so that whole, I don't think that in itself is kind of makes you because we get into animal welfare and the PETA groups and everything. So it's kind of the middle ground there. It's, you just kind of have to be able to straddle that fine line. Yeah, it's not an easy topic because most people, the public, the media don't like to hear it. I'm trying to think of some extreme cases where culling has come in and it's just helped kind of maintain some kind of normal ecology. I was in New Caledonia a couple of years ago, and this is an island in the South Pacific, that's a lot of introduced species: rats, cats, pigs, deer, and they're overrun with invasive species. And with, there's all these different methods of birth control and everything, but there's nothing that's going to get there in time to stop these invasive species from kind of taking over. So they brought in professional hunters to kind of at least keep the deer population down. And that's, I mean, it sounds a little bit harsh, but that's kind of what's needed it's a small island and there are endemic species being eaten out of house and home.
No, yeah. And again, a human-made problem, right? And so we're doing our best, but
yeah.
So there's this aspect of the officer the human intervention and culling, as you refer to it. I'm in a research setting, so we refer to it as euthanasia. Euthanizing, but I know the author notes that's not terminology typically used in this field. But I'm curious about your, I guess, view on introduce another species that's a natural predator, and then we're not doing it. It's a natural predator, and it seems like a more natural solution, but then you're creating your problem.
Yeah, exactly. That's happened in a number of places where people bring in something, say rabbits, and rabbits just take over. They breed like rabbits, and then you bring in some kind of predator to try to control the rabbits, but the predator takes out more than just the rabbits, because rabbits are adaptable. They're fast. They're going to take out the slower animals and the reptiles, amphibians, or whatever they can find. I think they use the stoat example in this book, and that's happened in a number of places where the more we bring in, the worse we make the situation. So I think, the idea is before we do any of these things to think this through, because it's not just getting rid of the rabbits, cane toads, or whatever. It's looking at the long-term impacts on that whole ecosystem as to what happens when you bring in cats to eat the rabbits.
Mhm.
However you want to phrase it.
Oh, yeah. I see. Sorry, Allison Brown has a question. Allison, if you want to unmute, love to hear it.
Yeah, I came in late. Does the book go into the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone and how beneficial that was?
The book does not talk about it. Not super heavy, not as much as they do other topics.
Okay. That's one of the great success stories. An animal was brought in that had been there before and had been eliminated because human beings fear wolves and wipe them out. And then the deer and things like that, moose were taking over and it was destroying the park. And when they brought back in wolves, practically over the dead bodies of all the ranchers and farmers around the park, all of a sudden the ungulate population was keeping in under control, and they began to see a normal turnover of plant life, and it was just wonderful, all from reintroducing wolves to the park where they had belonged all along.
Yeah, I don't know if Angela, you know more about, I don't know anything about that.
Yeah, it's come up again. I think there's now a huge call for culling wolves now because the population is doing well, and that's probably something that people want to look into because there's a lot of petitions that are being circulated to stop this kind of the killing of wolves. So I mean, it seems to be cyclical in that, you know, the wolves came back, the wolves are flourishing, and the packs that were introduced to Yellowstone, once they go outside the park, and they're going to, because they have territories, they're getting killed.
Yeah.
And there's, I mean, that is like probably the human wildlife conflict issue in the US today.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's really interesting. Thank you, Allison, for bringing that up. I didn't know about that. So that was really cool to learn about, similar to what we talk about in the book, but another US example. But I do like that the book, and you mentioned this, Angela, you know, the book talks about international examples, and we have examples here at home, but I mean, this is really a global issue. We're not alone in many ways, but we are not alone. And I thought it was interesting how with each example of, you know, quote, an animal breaking the law, or we'll call it a human animal interaction, one of the strongest considerations for how to respond was culture, and was whether that be local culture, whether that be a national culture, or even religious. I mean, we saw this in India. We saw this with the Vatican example. Rats are running amok. They're causing a lot of damage. But we don't believe in, you know, hurting the animals. So we don't really want to do anything to them. Whereas I think if you have lived here in Indiana for long enough, or maybe you lived in New York, you maybe don't feel similarly about rats or other rodents. And so I thought it was really interesting how strongly that played into their response. And I think maybe one of the more dramatic examples was at Midway, with the US military having a pretty standard military response to an animal. So that played a huge role. And so my next turn and talk question for everyone that I think will be an interesting discussion, how do you think individual and collective culture, whether that be a religious culture or a regional culture, how do you think that impacts both your individual reaction as an individual to an invasive or intrusive animal, but also maybe the broader public and even political interaction and political response to these criminal animals? Do you think that this shapes kind of how we respond to these animals and to these interactions? And then, as always, if you come up with some good examples, we would love to hear them. I will copy and paste that into the chat. But it's something I found myself thinking about off and on as we went through these international examples, because I had never thought about a Vatican rat problem or a Vatican bird problem until we talked about it. And I thought that was really interesting that religion played such a huge role for them and how they responded. And it forced them to be innovative. Maybe that was a good thing. And I will say my partner is a history teacher. I did make him read the Midway section because I thought that was very interesting. So I copy and pasted into the chat. we'll give you maybe 10 minutes, another 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll have hopefully a fruitful discussion. Okay, I will not join the breakout room this time. I will do what I'm supposed to do. Also, everyone have fun in your breakout room. I love being on the listener side of these because it's always so fun to get to hear what other people are thinking about. Because it usually is always so like personal examples. And I have to say, I did not think rats were a problem in the Vatican. That still blows my mind. But also, because I would not have thought so favorably of a rat. So I guess you have a lot of international experience. I'm kind of curious, as you've traveled and you've seen all these different examples, how strongly does that play into what people or even governments are willing to do as an intervention?
I think it is pretty strong. I was trying to think of some examples there's a lot of tolerance, I think, when you live in a culture that has actually kind of lived with, the newer term for conflict is coexistence. So that's kind of used a little bit more. It's actually a little less kind of a biased term, so I actually like it. So a lot of people have lived with some of these, like monkeys. I just remember when I was living in Africa, they would come in and steal my food, and you do things to prevent it, but you can only ripen mangoes, not in the fridge. So they would come in through the dining room window, take the mangoes and eat it in front of me, essentially. So there is that kind of degree of tolerance that I'm sure a lot of people have had. I don't know if you've ever been to Bali, but there is a temple out there where they warn people, they warn all the tourists, the baboons will try, or sorry, the macaques, wrong continent, macaques will try to steal your flip-flops. And, you don't really believe it until you actually are walking up the steps and you feel his hand try to grab your shoes. And again, I'm not sure why they do it, except maybe to entertain themselves. But there's no one trying to get the monkeys not to do it. But they just warn the tourists to be cautious of your shoes.
I'm gonna hop in here because this is the story from this book I've told everybody since I read it, which is the macaques in the book. I think she said they were ransoming people's belongings, so they would grab your purse and basically trade you for food. And I found like the value exchange there just like so fascinating, and just the way in which the monkeys are learning so much from being around us in that way and totally altering their patterns in their lives. It was very interesting to me. So that is a story. Do you know that the macaques will ransom your purse for food? I've been telling people that story.
Yeah, primates are smart. I think, this happens at zoos as well, where, keepers will trade the animals for something. If they take something that they're not supposed to have, you can actually, with primates, at least you can trade them and get whatever it is, hopefully back.
I was actually going to say that, Angela. I was just going
to say you should share your stories.
Yeah, there are multiple stories of like orangs in particular. Rocky was the master of learning how to dismantle anything, and he would get like big screws, and the keepers would freak out because they were like, oh my God, where is this big screw from? And he would show the keeper, and the keeper would have to go. He loves Coke. So they would get a can of Coke, and he would trade for Coke. He would trade for Cheerios, any sort of high value trade. So there's so many stories of particularly the orangutans doing that at the zoo.
That I'm going to have to go visit the orangutan exhibit again. Just knowing that story, I need to go back.
So Rocky's a character. You want to meet him anyway. He's the one who has that vocalization study done about him. He's the one who can recognize people and remember their tattoos. He likes it when people put their hair up in a ponytail. He's quite a character, so you should go and see him anyway.
Okay, I will pay Rocky a visit.
Definitely come by anytime. Just let us know.
Oh, oh yeah, that's right. You said you were at Indianapolis Zoo. Yeah.
Yeah, our office is technically on zoo grounds, but not quite in the zoo.
Good
But
to know.
we can get you in.
Just sneak me in. Oh my gosh, that's so funny. So, I mean, I don't know. I'm kind of interested in how monkeys make that value judgment, but I don't know if that's beyond the scope of what we're talking about. That's a whole nother tangent I think I could go off of. And like, how do they make those value judgments and how do they learn to up the ante? Because I mean, they've got to learn. I mean, they're not, I don't know. Okay. Maybe I need to talk to like an animal behavioral specialist who can like.
I think that, I mean, primates are just intelligent, they're smart, and they learn, you know, if this isn't working, I'm going to try something else. And that's what also makes them really scary in zoos, because they know how to, you know, they're always thinking, how do I get out and how do I pick this lock? So yeah, so I think they learn that way. I mean, I was, again, another Africa experience where I was in a wildlife sanctuary type thing, and I accidentally went to my purse and there was a little crinkling of plastic. And all of a sudden, all these, you know, little vervets, and they're scary because they have fangs, they reacted to, you know, the crinkling of plastic, thinking it's food. So they've adapted, they figured this out, and they're about to mug me.
Oh gosh. Well, it's weird because I mean, you know, talking about maybe cultural tolerance, coexistence versus it's a pest. I mean, we're like, oh, with the monkey, I don't want that response. But then with my cat, I'm like, please get out from under the bed. Here's the treat bag. Look, I'm making sound. So like we're rewarding it in some animals, but you know, punishing it in others. But ultimately, it's the same response, right? I mean, we're effectively teaching these animals what to do. It's bad when they do it.
Well, fortunately, you've got a domesticated animal, so you're trying to capture the good and bad behaviors, but I think a little harder to do in wild animals. Because yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, they would come when I was in the kitchen, they would come and they would come and check out the kitchen, and I'd stand in the doorway and would be this tiny monkey standing up, trying to size me up. And it's like, no, you can't come in the kitchen.
You're like, no, I am bigger than you.
But they try and they learn, and yeah, every once in a while they've gotten in before when I wasn't home, and you know, someone had to chase them out.
I mean, we're really teaching these responses, and I feel like even with like examples of like bigger animals, like I mean, they talk about the elephants. I mean, you're not inherently teaching them that like here's where the food is, here's where you can come. But when I feel like the size differential maybe plays. It's harder to like deter an animal. A little monkey, you can eventually teach it. Okay, when she's there, I can't come in. But
Yeah.
with an elephant, that's not really going on.
Yeah, you'd be surprised though. The first time I ever saw a wild Asian elephant was in a sanctuary, and I was at the ranger station, and we were having dinner, and it was so quiet you didn't hear it come in until you saw this trunk come in, because we were having papayas, and it was silent. It was a bull elephant, and I think, I mean, it reacted to the rangers. The rangers knew, and they were yelling at it, and it backed off, and
Wow.
it went to get some water from the well. But I think they also know that, you know, the rangers were going to do something if they didn't move.
Yeah. Okay. So even with, because I mean, that's what I kept kind of thinking of, because I was thinking smaller animals seems like you could teach deterrence a little bit, but I mean, even, you know, they talked about the skiing resorts with bears. I mean, part of it is humans not taking to the measures that are needed to stop actions. But I mean, it's also harder that, you know, the Fish and Wildlife interviews talk about it's harder to teach deterrence, because you can't just stand there. I mean, maybe you can. Most of us would not want to face, you know, head on a bunch of bears.
Yes. Definitely not. I learned from talking to the bear experts, if you're going out in bear country, always have bear spray. Invest in bear spray.
Okay, so next time I think about going into bear spray.
Yes.
So, I mean, I guess even with monkeys, maybe with bears, there's so many, how do you get creative, I guess, because I mean, especially primates, they're learning. They're like, how do you, I guess, approach that?
I think you just try different things. I don't know if it's like human elephant conflict. There's no silver bullet. You just try different things. And she talks about it a little bit in her book. You can't just leave things out there. You try a different thing. You try lights, or you try flashing lights or noise. But if it sits out there, they're going to they're going to adapt to it, get used to it, and go, oh, that's not going to do anything. I think it's repeated a few times. Like if you use the bird decoys, you really have to kill a bird every once in a while so that they realize this is not just a decoy.
I do love that the effigy idea came from Florida. That is so on brand. But so for those of you joining us from the breakout rooms, hello. We had some interesting discussion, and if you are interested, you can rewatch the live stream or catch it on Facebook maybe. So we talked about a lot of things. We were talking about how you need to go visit the Indianapolis Zoo, to go to the orangutan exhibit, go meet Rocky. Apparently he is a lot of fun, as we learned. But we also were talking about some things, not as related to our question, which was around culture and how culture impacts not only your individual response maybe to an animal, but how culture and maybe even religion are impacting maybe government or even locality response to animal interactions. So I'm curious what you guys talked about, or if you brought up any examples, maybe examples in the book or out of the book. There's probably a lot out there. I know we talked about some out of the book that were really interesting. So I'd love to hear from you all.
I'll start again. So we talked a little bit about how, you fear what you don't understand. So just that exposure culture to nature, and how if you grew up or you had the opportunities to actually experience nature and get to know nature and kind of learn that nature can be a cool place, but also respected, that, you grow up to be someone who is all about conservation and understanding what you could lose, where if you've not been exposed to that, nature is very scary. And so we gave examples of, inner city kids we've worked with that, a caterpillar or a raccoon or something comes across and they freak out because they're just not used to it. Their nature is, a couple trees in the park. And so just getting people exposed to nature and that kind of culture of like, hey, nature's a cool place. Like, let your kids go out and get muddy and stomp around in the water and get to learn what nature is, so that you can learn to appreciate it.
I think before we started this live stream, me and Megan were talking about how here deer and like even bears are a little more normal. I'm from Florida. I am very comfortable around alligators. Whether or not that's a good thing, probably not, but it's something growing up in Florida, you get very used to. But I realized when I moved here to Indiana, people were like, alligators, you've never seen one, have you? And it's like, yeah, of course I have. I've touched them, come get your dogs. It happens all the time. But I mean, yeah, that exposure piece and that education piece, but I mean, really nuanced when you get into like the urban environment. And yeah, it's harder. You have to put a little more work into having those experiences, and that educational piece is so important. And I think that's why it's so important we have the Indianapolis Zoo, and we have like something local that you can go and you can, not the same as going maybe to Eagle Creek, but you're still getting to, it's like an exposure therapy, right? You're exposing yourself to that and you're learning more about it. Super important, Jen. Thank you. Are there any other examples people came up with?
I don't know if this is a good example, but our group kind of bonded over getting have-a-heart traps and relocating chipmunks out of our backyard. We weren't sure whether or not we were just exchanging them.
I think if you asked Angela, it seems like she might say yes. Probably just got new chipmunk friends.
Yeah, and quite often they just come back. When I was growing up and going to school at University of British Columbia in Canada, we had the Canada goose problem because people would feed them and they stopped migrating. So there would be basically thousands of them, and humanely, we would round them up every year and drive them, a few hours out of Vancouver, and they would be back before we could even get back. So quite often, yeah, they're gone for a while, but they eventually come back.
I feel like we could talk about some Canada gooses up here. That should have been a whole section in this book. I feel like. Yeah, and Rita put in the chat about foxes were great control for rodents, but now they're eating pets. Yeah, that seems definitely a problem. As same problem in Florida with alligators. People don't really care about them until they eat your dog, and then it's get the gator out of the pond. I mean, definitely, interacting with humans, but also interacting with human adjacent animals maybe is a whole other category I think you could probably put into this, because when we view our pets we view our pets as family. So, I mean, we definitely kind of lump that all in with the animal-human interaction, but it is a large predator animal eating a smaller prey animal at the end of the day.
In our group, we brought up the Bible, the Old Testament, where God gave Adam dominion over the animals, and that tends to make people think that they can do anything they like. And they do.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, and I think that gets into like the personal response to animals. So like maybe you, like an individual might be more inclined to react to an animal, whether they be like a pest or in an, coexisting space. You might not react you might react differently than a person who feels that way. And so, I mean, that's another great example of like a religious influence on how we approach animals, and I think even plants. So a great point.
I'll throw something out there that wasn't mentioned in the book, but that I'm just like personally obsessed with, so I'm gonna bring it up. Is the Bill of Rights for the Great Apes that was passed in, I think, Britain. And so, they actually have like kind of a constitution or a legal structure in which to, deal with, ensure the rights of particular animals. And I just bring that up because it's such an interesting way to structure animal-human relationships, that you would, like think about constitutions and like legal frameworks and things like that in order to like figure out these responsibilities. And also, the assumption that certain animals do have rights, in relation to us. And that was also kind of one line I wrote down when I was reading through this was, the Buddhist who says, I don't have the right to decide whose life is more important, the person or the bear, so how these like values are being articulated and then like structured through law, through religion, through all these different like kind of cultural spaces. So I guess if I'm going to take that like to a question for our expert, like Angela, I'm really curious if you see any interesting like legal frameworks or I don't know, attitudes emerging in spaces that you've worked that are like governing this relationship in a different way. I guess I'm just kind of curious your reflections.
I think culturally, I haven't worked in India, but I mean, there's a lot of examples in the book about, the kind of the animal deities and kind of giving that kind of human persona to animals. But that has come up quite a bit recently with, I think the UK has deemed lobsters and crustaceans, or lobsters, I can't remember what the article was again, as being sentient beings. So in essence, I think I don't know if they've outlawed this, the boiling of live lobsters. And more recently, there's an article about, I think just what you were talking about with an elephant. It's an old story. It was an elephant at the Bronx Zoo. And I think it's come up in discussion amongst the conservation world. I think it's an interesting discussion because you get to see both sides of it. But legally, I'm not too sure whether there are kind of policies in place to address this, at least not here.
Well, and I mean not here. I mean, that's definitely I think that is definitely a cultural influence on, there's not more legal structure around conservation and around, human animal, I think even human animal interactions in general. I mean, there is some, and I think we should be, I'm grateful for what we have. We have something there, but could be flushed out maybe a little bit more. And maybe there's a cultural component to it, if any of us had to guess. And then Alison Brown gave a legal example from New Zealand. Yeah, I think it's super interesting how each country kind of it's interesting to think each country kind of has their own spin on it. They have their own value systems, but ultimately, we're all impacted by all of our choices. It is, we are stuck on this rotating marble, pummeling through space around the sun. And at the end of the day, we're all each other's neighbors. And so your choices or lack of choices affect my backyard just as much as my choices affect yours. And that could be an allegory for, a lot of things happening right now, including the pandemic. But it's just interesting to see how everybody approaches it differently. But then at the end of the day, we're all solving each other's problems. So I don't want to, if anyone else has anything they would like to add or other examples, open to it. But we could also move on. I have a quick group question, actually, not a turn and talk, but I'm curious to hear from the audience, and maybe even in our last turn and talk breakout, Angela, we were talking about tolerance and coexistence and how in a lot of cultures that is normalized. It's just especially with the monkeys stealing food, just happens. You got to deal with it. It's not, you just got to learn how to live with it. But we see, I'm giving the example of mice because that was the last example provided in the book. We tend to not be so tolerant and so nice of mice. And the author talks about how after writing the book and after getting into all of this with monkeys and bears and elephants, she felt like she couldn't kill the rat in her attic because it just felt inhumane. And so I'm curious to those of you in the audience who read the book, or even if you didn't and you just have been along the ride of this discussion, has your approach to the mouse, the house mouse, the common mouse, has that changed? Do you think you are going to try to maybe trap and relocate to your front yard, if your neighbor's yard, if you don't like them? Or, are you going to say, no, still a pest, I'm still going to get rid of it? I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. Let me be very clear. I'm not here to place a value judgment on your decision. I'm curious because I
actually at my mom's farm, every year the field, once you pull in the crops, the mice come into the house then. And that happened every year and they would trap it and, that type of thing. But I didn't quite get what she was talking about until I read the book, but they brought somebody in and they had them find where the mice were getting in. I can't remember the word for it, but it was also talked about in the book where they came in and they found and sealed up the house. Instead of killing the mice, you sealed up the house. And that's actually one of the big things I've noticed is she doesn't have the mouse problem every year, and trapping them didn't stop the mouse problem. Sealing up the house did stop it. So I think based on my experience, and then once I read the book, I was able to connect the dots on that, which I hadn't quite done. And I probably should actually learn the words for that too. That's probably the last thing I do, but it did change the way I view things. So.
Yeah, so finding an alternative intervention that solves the problem, but is not a, one or option 1 or 2. There's a sliding bar there. Interesting. And I'd call it sealing up the house. That works for me. Teresa, do you have any thoughts?
I do. We were one of the people who have a heart trap and moved 38 chipmunks across the river, but they swam across back, obviously. But anyway, they're amphibious, our chipmunks. What I noticed in Hawaii, a couple times I went to Hawaii, the mongooses, do you see mongoose or mongooses? I don't know. Anyway, mongooses were brought in to control the rats. But they had a bad effect that they eat the birds' eggs. Yeah. So I think that the balance of nature is a great idea, but boy, you better know what you're doing. and know what the consequences of what you reintroduce or introduce in the first place, how that's really going to what the ramifications will be on the food chain other than what you intended.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something me and Angela talked about in our turn and talk in our little breakout. I know I'm gonna be more thoughtful about, we'll call them animal invaders, maybe like space invaders.
Well, I'm tolerant of the spiders in my house, but the mice have an entire nature preserve to live on. Any mouse that comes into my house is doomed.
All right, so it still counts. Listen, spider appreciates it.
Yeah.
I think for me, the mice thing it made a difference what they were doing, because I used to live in Northern Virginia and I had a very large house and a basement I didn't use. And I knew they were down there because we used to have these things called sprickets or spider crickets or camel crickets. And I would see the legs, but I would never see the bodies. And that didn't bother me. So I just sweep up after them. I think it's when they started, and this only happened once during the winter when they got into my pantry and chewed through the bag of flour. So I did set up traps for them and not successful, but come spring, I just went ahead, the same thing. I just plugged up all the entry points and sealed them off and never had a problem again. But they did, I think during the pandemic, another pandemic thing that happened was because I wasn't driving anymore, they ended up chewing through my oil light sensor in the car. So that was annoying.
Okay, different type
there was a conflict there.
Major conflict. I mean, your oil's important.
I actually, one of my first cars that I got, that came back from one of the fields, and I'll never forget they even had like little gates around it when it was a used car. And yes, there was a mouse trap. There was a mouse nest inside the car that started burning as I was driving down the road. So it was coming in, the smoke was coming in. Yeah. So yes, the mice get into the engines quite a lot. Yes.
I don't want you to go into the smell. I know it could not have been pleasant.
I don't really remember the smell. I think I was just worried about the embarrassment because I was in the city when this happened, when it actually caught on fire. And it was like, I look like Cheech and Chong as I'm like rolling down the windows and my whole car is smoking up because there's a mouse nest. And the thing is once I got out of the car, I could see that they had tried to trap around where the mice must have liked that area, because it looked like they had tried to keep, but the mice had somehow still nested inside that car at that location, which I was kind of bizarre, I guess. It was kind of funny though, with the ceiling of the house, that's exactly where the snake was hanging out too. It was like right in that area. The little garter snake was hanging out right where they sealed up a big hole, which I thought was kind of interesting. So
yeah. He knew something we didn't at the time.
Yeah, it's like there goes his food.
Yeah, he's like, come on, this was a Arby's drive-through.
Yeah, I had a function, and now my function has been eliminated. But I'm sure the snake has found someplace else to hang out.
Oh yeah, he found where the mouse went. He went.
He has located the mouse nest by now, I'm sure.
For sure.
Do garter snakes eat mice at all? Do they?
Maybe it was entertainment. That was his little IMAX theater, watching him run in and out of there, and he was just having a good time.
Yes, he was.
And I'll tell you, my experience with mice, they will, whatever you think they cannot do, whatever you think they will not do, they will do, they can do, and it just defies the laws of physics.
I don't know how they got through. I mean, these little grates were really small. They weren't like fish wire or anything, but they were really small grates. And those mice still you could tell that it happened before, but now I couldn't get the burning mouse nest out of my car. So I was like, because quite frankly, the grate was there. I'd have to get screwdrivers and take it out. And yeah, we were just kind of stuck. Luckily, no cops showed up and I didn't have to explain anything about, basically the smoke going everywhere, but it worked itself out. But I guess I could have explained that well enough, but it would have just been really, I guess I would have been more to the story.
Yeah, that could have been another chapter. That could have been a whole.
Another chapter.
We have the part 2 right here in this book club. We've come up with enough stories.
How I ended up talking to a cop in the middle.
Yeah, and so I don't want to. I want to make sure you guys have time to ask our expert Angela Yang any questions you might have. Because I could sit here and talk about all the specialist groups and all of your international travels. You probably have wonderful stories. But I know you guys probably have questions for her, so I'd love to open the floor.
So Angela, I know you're working based at the zoo, but I didn't really understand what you actually do.
I do a lot of meetings online these days. And so basically I'm here to kind of support. So I told you about the IUCN and the 18,000 special experts out there. So about 10,000 of these experts fall into the species realm. And so with these groups, basically we find ways to support them and have basically to move conservation action, because they're all volunteers and no one has time basically to do a lot of these things. So where I come in is I'm not so much a researcher, I've gotten away from that, but I've also been able to actually do conservation action on the ground and also get the resources for it. So basically I'm trying to help, not the bear specialist group right now, but I'm trying to help another specialist group. I don't know if you've heard of an animal called the okapi. It's like the giraffe. It's giraffid, and to be able to do a lot of the work on the ground, I'm helping them secure some funding from the UK government, and then also getting some tools, resources, and some experts involved to actually help them monitor and evaluate how they're doing. So it's complicated. It's different every day. We're trying to also do some of the conservation at the messaging and trying to kind of tell the stories a little bit better. Yeah, it's pretty much kind of the whole everything these days. We've been around for about a year, and I think we've kind of gotten our strategy in place, and we're kind of now a little more focused. But you know, I've got 32 groups, kind of range a lot. There's high capacity groups, and there are ones who still need help. So I do a whole range of things every day.
I have a question about, it was mentioned in the book about climate change and how that's affecting different species, the penguins where their fish are going deeper water to find the cooler water and things. And even here in Indiana, my group knows that I have an affinity for vultures at this point, and where the black vultures have come over the Ohio River. And now, in Indiana, they're giving licenses to shoot the vultures, which, they're just coming over because our climate has changed and they're moving farther north. Does your group address anything like that? I mean, are you looking at the climate change impacts?
Yes, I used to be the chief conservation officer for Rainforest Trust before this job. And that was a big thing to consider, because when you're creating protected areas today, what is that going to look like 10 years from now with climate change, 10 or more years? So one of the areas that we were working in was Ecuador. And because of the plants and the fruiting trees for this hummingbird species, very rare hummingbird, is to kind of think ahead in 10 years, where are these plants going to be able to grow? So, and to be able to think, when we're creating these protected areas, maybe we should be looking at higher altitudes, because as the world gets warmer, you're going to need to, the plant's going to move up, and then the hummingbirds with them. So that's a big part of what we think about, is a lot of climate change modeling. I don't know if you're on social media at all, but I just did a post for a deer, a South American deer called a womble, which is, according to the experts, the most endangered large animal in the Americas. But this deer has a very restricted range in Patagonia. And because of climate change, it lives on the edges of glaciers. And as you know, with climate change, the glaciers are disappearing. So I think the climate change models are saying that it's going to lose another 50% of its habitat by 2050. And this is a population that has basically 1,500 animals right now. So that's not looking good for the deer. So yeah, that's actually a big part of what kind of people are thinking about in conservation and kind of building into some of these plans.
You give me hope. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Angela?
Sorry, yes.
Yes, this is Teresa. I'm asking if, I don't think that on an individual basis, no matter how careful we are, we're going to be able to make much difference in the climate change. Do you have suggestions for us how to lobby to get corporations and big like departments of transportation and things like that to cooperate to slow down global warming? I don't think we can reverse it, but boy, we sure better slow it down.
Yeah, I think the best way to do this is lobby your local politicians and vote, because I think that's going to make the biggest impact. And also to hold companies, politicians, everyone kind of accountable for their promises, because people will make these grandiose promises, but this happens a lot when, you know, political regimes change over, or, you know, and then no one's is accountable. People make these commitments, but if they're not held to them, and that's really important for corporate. It is a lot of petitions, lobbying, voting, but I think, I mean, especially with that last climate change, the COP26, which happened in the fall, there's been a lot of global commitments made to reducing rising global temperatures. And I think that's where, as individuals and as citizens of Earth, we need to start holding people accountable to these commitments they've made, both monetary and kind of reducing fossil fuels and all of that. So I think that's kind of where we are right now. As individuals, yes, I try my best at doing what I can in my little world. But you're right, because, you know, our little individual efforts they're cumulative, but I think climate change is happening so quickly that we need other interventions.
Thank you. Yes, I agree.
Yeah, thank you, Teresa, for asking. With climate change is something I feel like we kind of touch on, you know, especially in these nature-centered books. I mean, it's something that's all on our minds, and obviously really complex and multifaceted. And I think we're going to keep bringing it up as we go. And I really like your suggestions. Sometimes it's hard to maybe find the hope, but also, you know, finding what can I do if my, you know, one little recycling bin isn't enough. So thank you for, you know, leaving us with that. I think that's a great way to end this discussion on this book. Yeah, a wonderful book. I know Mary Roach is always a popular author with this group, but this was my first, I gotta admit. So I might have to go back and reread some of her other books if they were this enjoyable. So thank you for joining us, especially a huge thank you to our guest, Angela Yang. I could listen to you talk about your stories forever. They are so interesting.
Of course, it's been a pleasure talking to everyone, and it's great that people are so interested in this topic.
Oh my gosh, yeah, listen, you came to the right place. And hopefully next month, we're hoping to meet you all in person at the Black Acre Tap Room. And Allison already told us, I Contain Multitudes, a wonderful book, wonderful glowing reviews. I hope you will all join us for this wonderful discussion by Ed Young, talking about microbiomes and microbes and you know, we've talked about viruses and stuff before, but we're talking about it maybe in a little different way. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time, Angela, and thank you for all your time and listening to us. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your night, and I hope to see you in a month at Black Acre.
Thank you, and have a great evening. Come visit the zoo.
Yeah, that's the message, right?
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks everyone.
Bye. Thank you. Bye, y'all.